I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Lori Frasina, and I am the National Vice President and Executive Director of Voices for Healthy Kids, and one of the many coordinators for the National Collaborative for Infants and Toddlers, also known as the NCIT. In the chat today, if you could please share your name, location, and organization, that'll give us a sense of who's on the line with us today, and we are so glad that you are here. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this webinar and to be your moderator today, 10 days or so before the big election. We are focusing on post-election season, which probably seems either way too soon or way too far away, depending on how you're embracing this year's election. But this is really the best time for us to stop and map out our strategy for what we want to do after the election happens, and how we engage our supporters and how we engage our coalition partners in being prepared to start on the right foot with elected officials for the next session, which starts 10 days and another day from there. Literally after the election, we need to start doing this work. So if you don't really know where to start, or maybe you've never thought about that, maybe you wait until the session starts, you are absolutely in the right place. Today, we're also launching a new toolkit that we've done with the help of M&R Wind, and it expands on the lessons we're sharing in this webinar. So keep an eye out for the link at the end of the webinar. We'll drop it into the chat and we'll share it with you via email as well if you've been registered. We hope that you use the toolkit with your colleagues to really plan out your strategies for the next year and beyond, and reach out to us anytime for free guidance and support. Please tell us what worked and tell us what doesn't work so we can get it better next time. But we really do like to share with other advocates around the country when you've had success with a particular strategy in building those post-election relationships with newly elected officials and their staff. So as we bring this toolkit into practical application, we brought in some special guest speakers today that I think you're going to love, that will bring three very different perspectives on making this real. We're going to have an opportunity at the end of the webinar for an out loud Q&A, but feel free to start dropping your questions into the chat and we will follow along and make sure we get those. And you'll have a time at the end also if you wanted to come off mute and ask your questions of any of the speakers out loud. Before getting in, I just want to remind everybody of some of the norms for these Zoom meetings. If you could keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking, that would be terrific. We really do want to answer every question we can. So if you put it in the chat, even if you want to ask it out loud, that will assure that we can get back to you. In the event there's so many questions we can't get back to everybody, we'll follow up with people in writing if they put something in the chat that we were not able to respond to during the course of the webinar. The dedicated Q&A session at the end will be great and hopefully lively, and all questions are fair questions, so feel free. You have a group of speakers here who are not shy and hesitant to give you their opinions, guidance, and real vulnerable answers to some of the things that they've experienced in multiple seats around this advocacy table. When you do ask questions out loud during the Q&A, you can come off mute, obviously, to ask those questions. That said, we are going to move into the full part of this. We will be recording things, like I said, and we can get back to you. So we've got insights and case studies from these distinguished speakers. We've got a lot of experience about successfully engaging candidates during and after a campaign. There's other materials that we can share with you in the chat from other election-related work we've got going. But we're really focusing today on those days, weeks, months, and years after the election. And this is a time that I sometimes think as advocates we forget about as being really ripe with opportunity. I have not been in a lobbyist or grassroots organizer's role for a few years now, but I remember when I was doing some of this work, when I was doing it many years ago, and this was really a fun time of year because it was almost like back to school every single time a new session started and every single time those elections were over. This is the time when those manners we were all raised with come in handy. So sending out a congratulatory note and letting those folks, whether they're newly elected for the first time or re-elected, congratulating them on their election and letting them know you're hoping to collaborate with them and work with them and get to know more about them is a really good idea. If the person you're reaching out to has never been in office before, this is such a fabulous time to make your case, build those relationships. Those relationships could last you out throughout your entire career. And so using that time to reach out to those newer folks when, quite frankly, every other advocate and lobbyist in your state or community is probably trying to get in the door of leadership, is a really smart strategy. It shows respect, it shows curiosity, it gives you an opportunity to find out if they have any connections to your issue. It gives you a really good opportunity to ask why they ran for office and keep all of this in mind, and to make some of those connections early on that your relationship going forward will be foundational. And those early visits, those early relationships, that first connection you make to freshman lawmakers, they will never forget it, and they will be your friends and understood that you see them throughout their career. So don't discount them. And think about this as, I said, back to school. For some of us in a lot of places right now where political polarization is as charged as it is, we also really want to think of this as turning a page and potentially having a new experience and a new opportunity to build or rebuild a relationship with elected officials that we might have had conflict with before. Or worse, we didn't even have conflict with them. We didn't know them and just assumed that we were not on the same side of things. So really taking this fresh look, looking at everybody who's elected, breaking up the list with your coalition, taking turns and assigning who's going to reach out to whom, what are we going to share, how are we going to introduce ourselves, our organization, our cause, our coalition as partners to them early, before there's even any bill filed. This is really your time to do that and to really think of this with that open heart, open mind, and hope that they will do the same with you. So without further ado, I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing Boston City Councilor Julia Mejia, who is a dear friend of mine, one of my definitely my favorite elected official in the country, but also one of my favorite human beings. Julia is a city councilor at large. She is the first Afro-Latina to hold a seat on the Boston City Council. Her journey from the Dominican Republic to Dorchester at age 5, raised by a single undocumented mother, instilled in her a commitment to advocacy. As a graduate of the Boston Public Schools and college, she became a community organizer, empowered individuals across diverse spectrums to engage in political processes and more. Winning her first term by a single vote, she has since led the passage of 15 pieces of legislation and secured millions of dollars for Boston's communities. Notably, she established the Government Accountability Committee to address issues in education, housing, and transportation. Now in her third term, Julia remains dedicated to informing, influencing, and inspiring political participation for all means all, inclusive representation. Councilor Mejia is joining us today to share from her experience, perspective, offer advice on the ways that advocates can get to know elected officials, and how to ask smart questions that result in relationship rather than conflict. So Julia, as you kick off here, I'm gonna ask you to address what you've learned that you've been on both sides of that advocacy relationship, both as a community organizer and a parent organizer on the outside, trying to break in and have influence and build those connections with those people who have the power to give us what we want. And now, as one of those people with the power to give us what we want, how does that work for you? And maybe start out with some advice on how we can do a better job as advocates as we're getting to know lawmakers like you that are starting out in that fresh page, hopefully back to school mentality as they come on. So Julie, if you could take it away, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm super excited and grateful to have the opportunity to be with you all here today. Yes, I won by 1 vote, and everyone's like, how we did that. And that was just really deep relationship building and community organizing. And so that was what got me into the seat. And as a legislator, it is the same tactic that I've been using to continue to have those relationships. So I think that even before the person wins, I think as part of the courtship, you should start identifying who are the folks that are running for office, getting to know them while they're on the campaign trail, because it really helps you establish a relationship in the earlier stages, you know. And once they get in, they've already have had an opportunity to get to know you, you've gotten to know them, and that's where the accountability comes in. Because what oftentimes happens is that elected officials get elected and then they forget all the promises that they've made. But if they've met you along the way, then you could say, remember that coffee hour that you hosted and we talked about X, Y, and Z? Well, I really want to figure out how we can work together to bring some of these ideas to life. So that could be a easy entry point. But if you're not a political junkie and you haven't been paying attention, and all of a sudden you have a whole new slate of electeds who have come into office, then you are going to have to start from scratch. And what does that look like? I think one of the most important things that I have learned here on the council, and I represent, just to give people some insight, what at large means is I represent over 800,000 constituents, almost a million if you count those who are not documented, right? And my charge is to make municipal laws that impact the quality of life for the families that we serve, as well as approve the yearly city budget. But within that, I have an opportunity to be in community with folks. And what I've learned is, having been on the opposite end, the one who was always hooting and hollering and screaming at elected officials because they were ignoring us. Now that I'm on the inside, not every elected is the same. So I just want to manage those expectations, but I've been super intentional about making sure that I am in community with coalitions that are doing work that are relevant to the committees that I chair. So I think one of the recommendations that I would make, if you're a coalition leader, if you're a part of a advocacy group, is first look into whatever level of government you're going to be targeting and look at the committees. And then based on those committees, start identifying and asking for meetings with those individuals, so that you can start establishing a rapport. Like you, for those folks who are not elected, we always feel like politicians only come around when they want something. Well, we as politicians feel the same way about some coalition folks. Sometimes we think that you only want to come around when you want us to file a bill for you, or you want to lobby us, and that feels transactional. So for me, it's really important to build meaningful, deep relationships, even if it's just a matter of like touching base, even if you're not advocating about a particular issue that doesn't fall within your wheelhouse, but you know it's something that this individual cares about. Just even connecting them to another coalition that is doing some work around that space shows a mutual setting the groundwork for collaborative and more. I don't know how much time we wasted, and I'm so sorry, but I was really talking about the importance of level setting and relationship setting, that it's a two-way street, right? It is, you have to recognize your own power and the resources that you bring. So it doesn't feel like just one-sided. And I think that that is a really great way to establish relationships with electeds, so that they see you as a viable resource, not just someone who just deeply cares about your own issue, but that you're willing to work in partnership with them, or even provide them some guidance around some of the other issues that may not pertain to your line of work. I think that that relationship building is really important, and it also puts you in a level playing field. It's not power over, it's power with. And you walk in there as a resource, as a valuable resource in the community. And I think that also establishes that relationship. I think one of the most important things that when we're asking about questions is really helping don't go in there and just start with your spiel. Is really get to know the individual. Ask them, what are some of the things when you're talking about early childhood education, what are some of the things that they deeply care about? What are some of the things that they're hearing in the chamber about a particular issue? Use that opportunity to gather information. Also identify who are the other targets that you should be reaching out to. So you walk out of that meeting with a list of other folks that are either in different committees that also care about the issue, that then you can then follow up with those folks as you're trying to advance your issues, and ask them, would you be willing to make that introduction? Listen, at the end of the day, it's your tax dollars that pays for our salary. So we're not doing any favors by having a meeting with you. We're not doing you any favors by making the connection to our colleagues. That's our job. And you should feel at ease and empowered to ask us to do just that. And then the last thing that I'll say, especially in this political climate, and 7 minutes go by fast, and I don't even know if I still have any time left. I got 1 more minute left. How many? 2? Oh, wow. 3? Oh, great. Oh, I love that. So listen, in the political climate that we happen to be in, I have realized that we have this tendency of just calling people out when they're not with us on an issue. And we have an amazing opportunity, as Laurie said, to really turn the page in this moment in time to a culture of calling people in and inviting them to be a part of a process, whether they agree with your vision and or your values or the issue that you're trying to push. Because we're not going to get anywhere if we're in conflict with each other. And I know this as someone who was on the outside during a very highly political debate here in the city of Boston that divided people. I decided that I wasn't going to be one or the other. I was going to create space for both of these groups to really build relationships and come to some consensus. Because the goal really is for everybody to feel like they've lost and for everybody to feel like they've won. If we could do that in your organizing, then you're going to be able to move your agenda forward. But you're not going to do it by leaving other people behind. And I'll leave you with this. I'll leave you with this. And I say this everywhere that I go, that nothing about us without us is for us. So recognize the role that you play in the decision-making process. 2, never leave yourself at the door to make anyone else feel comfortable. And 3, never water yourself down so you could be digestible. Because if they don't like you, let them choke lightly. Normally, I'm a little bit more aggressive with that, but I say these things is because we should never minimize our passion for what we're trying to get across, and we should bring our full authentic selves into every space, because that's what we need right now. It's a little bit of passion and a lot of fire. Thank you.
Counselor, can I ask you one more question?
Yes.
Because I love your 3 things. And when thinking about you and work I got to watch you do in Boston as a parent organizer and a community organizer, I think you have a 4th rule, and that is always bring somebody with you. And I just hope you could say a little bit about opening up tables and making people comfortable who have never been to City Hall, never been to the State House, never met with an elected official, what our role has to be as people that are always bringing others in.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked, because I just got so right into all of this. That when I first started off as a community organizer, working with parents, they would always invite me to the meeting because I was the leader of the organization or the movement. And for me, it was never really about me. The real power came from the parents. So I would always bring parents with me to all of my meetings and to conferences and to events, and built their capacity as leaders. And in doing that, what you do is you have a little entourage that you're rolling up with, right? So it's harder to ignore also. So I think from a visual standpoint, when you have a group of people who are walking into an office, it also says, that you're not walking in alone. And it also creates an opportunity for parents to see themselves reflected in the advocacy. And when you have the ability to also be vulnerable, and it's like giving people permission to do just that, to tell their story from their heart, to speak, even if their voice quivers, all of those things the parents saw me do, and it built their capacity so that they went on to do it as well.
Thank you so much, Counselor. I know you need to run to a hearing and you'll be back to join the Q&A part of this time with the National Collaborative, but thanks you so much for that. We appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you in half hour or less. Thanks so much. At this point, I am going to turn it over to my colleague and our next speaker, Dave Oberent, who is the Government Relations Director for the American Heart Association in Arkansas. He's going to be sharing his perspectives around researching newly elected officials, building a strong target list for your advocacy efforts, and getting in the door in ways that can be influential and memorable. After receiving his master's degree of higher education from Montana State University, Dave worked on legislative sessions in Montana, lobbying on behalf of higher education, and realized that his passion was in politics and public policy. Since then, Dave has worked on various political and policy efforts around the country, including congressional, senatorial, and presidential elections, as well as statewide initiatives to raise the minimum wage and to pass education reform. Dave, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate being invited, and I'm a little terrified of following a dynamic speaker like that, but I'll do the best I can. But yeah, so I'm talking about meeting with lawmakers and targeting those lawmakers, and kind of some tips and tricks when I visit with lawmakers. And so Um, I think the most important thing when meeting with lawmakers is targeting, right? And in any campaign you run, the two most valuable resources you have are time and money. And of those two, money is the most important. Or, I mean, time is the most important, excuse me. And so all the work I do, I try to make sure it's targeted. And I try to make sure that, I am using my time wisely and in the most appropriate ways. So generally when targeting, I'm going to focus on the most important members of whether you're at the council or typically for me, it's a legislature, um, the most powerful members of that. And that tends to be people with more seniority, and they tend to be people in leadership positions. So oftentimes, in many cases, those positions aren't determined until after the election. But sometimes right? Oftentimes there might be someone that's been a Speaker of the House for years, or the President of the Senate. And that chamber is not going to change. And so targeting those leadership positions, Speaker of the House, Senate President, Majority Whip, um, and then the committees that your issue might be in, right? So if you're doing health policy, you want to talk to that healthcare committee. If you're doing energy policy, you want to really focus on the energy committee chairs, right? So your first conversations should be those people with those powerful positions, and they tend to be the ones that kind of make the wheels move in the legislature. Also, generally too, some of the more powerful people tend to be people with more seniority, so those folks that have been there for a while. But sometimes I think the most difficult thing is meeting with new lawmakers and trying to figure out which ones to target. Not you go through your list on election day. You try to figure out which ones are incumbents or not. They're usually identified in the results. They have an I by their name. So you're targeting the ones that don't have that I or tend to be the new lawmakers. When you're talking with new lawmakers, I think there's an important thing with prioritization, right? I try to prioritize candidates that have won really expensive or high profile elections. That tends to mean that they're more moderate candidates because that district or that race was in play. Typically with our gerrymandering, most of our candidates are almost predetermined, right? And I think that's an important aspect here too, is sometimes the race is determined in the primary. And so you can start having a meeting with that lawmaker as that general election is going on, because you have a pretty good idea who that is. Our governor's race here a couple of years ago, when we were talking about healthy school meals for all, well, she was technically running for the general election because we already knew what that outcome was, and we knew she was going to be our next governor. So when it comes to some of those races, like I said, those candidates that are in high profile or in close races, that's going to be more of a moderate district. They'll tend to be more moderate candidates. They'll also be more high profile, which probably means they're going to have a little bit more sway when they get into elected office. So I think those are great ones to start with. With all my work, especially in a state that has the large majority of either party, um, talking to candidates in the party of power, they also tend to be the ones that make things happen. And so I put a real priority on law, actually, since I candidates, I said lawmakers, and don't neglect lawmakers you think won't agree with you. And in fact, they're probably some of the most important ones to visit with, right? Those tend to be the ones that you're going to have to change minds to get those votes you need. And they might feel like some of the more intimidating ones. I'll generally say that most meetings with lawmakers are treated with respect. Respect is given, respect is returned. I've never really had any kind of really negative lawmaking meetings one-on-one where the person just had an ideological difference with what I was working on or whatever and kicked me out or anything, right? But I do think there's a natural tendency sometimes to be more nervous about those candidates that you don't think are going to agree with you. But I do think those are some of the most important meetings you can have. See what we got next year. And next slide. Yep. So being intentional. I think lots of times people make the mistake that they're just going to meet with lawmakers at the Capitol, right? I'm going to see them walking around. I'm going to pass them in the hall. I'm going to introduce myself. And if we go to the next slide, I think what I want to say is be intentional about your work, right? For one, schedule that meeting, right? Don't plan to run into somebody at a function, and don't plan to meet up with them in the halls of the Capitol. And I think that's a mistake some people have. But you really want to make sure you're being intentional. You're going to schedule that meeting and do your research ahead of time with that candidate, right? The obvious things here, right, are going to be their campaign websites. But I think that Googling and reading interviews and profiles are the most important thing. And so it's important to know where they stand on issues. But I think the personal details are the most important, right? Because those personal details about their life, those are the things you're going to find that connection on. If you're a dog person like myself and you see that they got a dog or mention their dog or something, you can bring up that dog and start talking dogs, right? This is about relationship building. Policies move because of relationships. And I don't mean that like entirely, but yes, I mean, if you have a good policy and a good campaign, if you have good relationships, you're going to be more successful. So with a lot of these meetings, especially initial meetings with lawmakers, um, using this time to make those personal connections is incredibly valuable. A couple of things I think about when going in with meetings with lawmakers. I think new members tend to be more ideological and more idealistic, and I tend to kind of have that view. Um, Seniority and being in the legislature or the city council for a long time, I think people get more seasoned and they learn about compromise and how things go. But I do think when people first get in, that is that kind of that spit and vinegar kind of attitude and their idealism and stuff is really kind of driving force. And it takes them a long time to kind of understand how the system works and how to be effective at their job. And for a long time, the 70s, a famous political consultant named Lee Atwater coined the phrase that all politics is local. And sometime around 2010 or so, that has gone away. And all politics is national now. And so I think I have that lens as well. National narratives are going to be important no matter if you're working at the city council level, the school libraries anymore, legislative levels, wherever they might have you, right? Those national narratives are driving policies and thoughts and that kind of thing. And so I always have that as a frame of reference when I go into a meeting. And so things I might want to avoid talking about or leading into or that kind of thing, even if you don't feel like it's an important issue in your state, right? Immigration is going to be a big deal in states that are not in a border. Abortion is a big deal in states like California and Michigan, or I mean Massachusetts. That it's not impacting there. So these national narratives are important. I think it's something to either avoid for topics to avoid or to lean into. And next slide. So your initial meetings, it's an introduction, and I think that's an important thing. And I want to go focus back on this. I can't say this enough. So if we go to our next slide here, making that personal connection is one of the most important things you're going to do. Don't go into a meeting and say, "Hi, I'm Dave with the Heart Association. Let me tell you about cardiovascular emergency response plans," and just get into it, right? You need to build that investment. And I think that taking that time to have those conversations, I might find like, just talking back and forth and chit chatting feels like a waste, but that's building rapport. That's getting to know somebody. So I think that's important. Now, if we're having these meetings right after the election or even during the election cycle, I kind of think of these as introductory meetings, right? And I plan to do a follow up more than likely as I'm whipping votes in the future. I think of these as an introduction to myself, an introduction to the policy or policies that I'm doing, right? They're going to be overwhelmed at this when the election is going on. They're taking tons of meetings. They're deciding who's going to be in leadership. If they're a newly elected person, they don't even know where their office is yet. So they got a lot going on. I'm introducing them to me. I'm introducing them to my policies. I'm prepared to talk in depth as I want, but I'm not going to get crazy in depth with some of this stuff, right? I'm introducing the topic. You can kind of read the room. Some people are policy wonks. They want to know everything. But for me, I just try to make sure I'm introducing that concept. I'm giving them the information they need to know. I'm trying to make sure that my messaging is getting across, but I'm not going to bombard them with stats and information. One thing I forgot to kind of mention too when I was talking about being intentional. I think that's coming up here. So, and I also think too, and I say this too, it's an investment in a relationship. It's not a sales pitch. So I think those sales pitches are kind of more for when your session is actually starting. I think right now it's about laying framework, laying groundwork. Relationships, when you're building a relationship with a lawmaker, I think one kind of rookie mistake or mistake that new people have when dealing with lawmakers is they know that they want to build this relationship and they get in there and they just start asking questions. Where are you from? How many kids do you have? What do you do for your job when you're not a lawmaker? Or what did you do before this? Or whatever the case may be. one important thing that I think is often forgotten is your story, right? Why are you there? Relationships are a two-way street. I worked on a big statewide campaign one time, and we were trying to figure out why our volunteer recruitment numbers were low. And this was something we kind of realized that our organizers were not sharing kind of themselves with the volunteers; they were just learning about the volunteers. And so by sharing themselves, we found that we made deeper connections with volunteers. Our numbers were increasing. We made stronger relationships. I found the same thing to be with lawmakers. So don't forget, building and establishing relationships a two-way street. As much as you're asking about them, you need to give up yourself and your story as well. And for whatever work and passion drives you, your story is probably inspiring and a great way to connect with people. And also when meeting with lawmakers, this is an important one. We touched on it the last time. The messenger makes the message. So it's great to have an introduction. It's great to be working on a beautiful policy that's going to be great and it's going to change the world. But the thing that's going to be most powerful is somebody that has been impacted by that policy or can have the firsthand experience of that policy. Someone that can share their story with a lawmaker of what you're working on is going to leave a bigger impression than anything else. And so any chance you get to be able to bring somebody along to share that story, talking points are one thing, but someone that can truly talk about the message and the thing you're trying to get across without ever looking at a talking point because it is them and they know it and that's who they are, it's always going to be your most powerful way to move a message. So always try to find those people with those great stories who could be your messenger. And finally, a few more things. I like how happy this person is. I don't think I've ever been that happy about anything in my life, but I kind of joke here. Are you really friends until you hang outside of work? I think being in the Capitol is great. And if you're in some cities, or some states, maybe that's your only chance, right? But I think when you can meet outside of the Capitol, it really helps to distinguish yourself. Making the effort to go in district, whether that's a state legislator or whatever, and meet them where they're at and when they're outside of the Capitol, I think it's a much more memorable experience. I think it's a much more relaxed experience with your lawmaker. I think you're going to make a stronger connection. I think it shows initiative on your part. So I think those in-district meetings are really a way to kind of set yourself apart from everybody else that's roaming the halls of the Capitol or City Hall. I think that's important. If you can't do that, can you meet outside of the Capitol? In a lot of smaller states, this is really a common thing. We meet at a brewery. We might meet at a coffee shop. But once again, I think there's something about the way our brain works, right? And you kind of go back, and if they're thinking about meetings they had in their office, it's a long list. But there might not be a lot of meetings you had at a particular coffee shop or whatever. And I think that helps distinguish yourself. So I find that I try to have as many of those meetings outside of the Capitol, especially that time prior to session or prior to City Hall. I think that those kind of more informal settings are a much greater way to kind of establish that relationship and develop a really good rapport. And also be a member of the community, right? Go to events that these lawmakers might be at, and be seen and be available, and let them know that you're a resource to them as much as you need them for your help that we're working on. You can help them in the work they're working on, and so try to be an active member of your community, and meet lawmakers where they might be. I think
Thank you so much. That was terrific. Sit tight because we're going to want to come back to you with the Q&A session, but thank you so much for that. And I get to now introduce Joshua Harris, who is the Communications Director for the National Collaborative for Infants and Toddlers. And today he's going to share some ways to leverage communications post-election. Before joining Voices for Healthy Kids and the National Collaborative for Infants and Toddlers, he was the Director of Communications for Black and Brown People Vote, and he worked actively with the NAACP. Joshua has more than a decade of experience in government relations and communications with a specialty in crisis communications at the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which always comes in handy post-election. Welcome, Joshua.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay? I
You
just
sound
put
great.
in my headphones. All right, great. Thank you so much. Excited to be here. Boy, we've got had some great speakers come today. I'm excited for the opportunity to present to you and talk to you about communication specifically, and how we can use them post-election. Up next slide, Angelina. I'm not sure where that slide is. There we go. No, that is not the slide. Next slide. Oh, let me pull it up. I'll pull it up on my screen for us. No worries. Um, we're going to talk about communications. And one of the reasons that I'm excited to talk about communications and what we can do there post-election and the importance of us engaging um, is because it is a tremendous opportunity for us to continue to movement building. One second, let me get this up. That's important. And so I'm excited to talk about this because there's so many different ways and opportunities. And I think that oftentimes we think that election day is like the finish line for us. And the reality is that election day is just the beginning of the work. Many of us who are advocates have done advocacy work in many different capacities. And so it never ends. And you ultimately end up working with partners from that you've worked with in previous capacities, whether it be in the same space or not. And so the reasons that it's important, as I mentioned, we're trying to keep the movement alive. Just because election day is upon us doesn't mean that the work stops. And so we want to be sure um, to continue to engage our advocates that we've built over the campaign, the duration of our campaign. And we know that consistent strategic communications play a key role in positioning our prenatal to three policies as priority during any legislative cycle. And so NCIT member organizations and their supporters can set the stage for impactful policy wins beyond the election by taking advantage of post-election momentum. You've got all these eyes on you and all these people who are paying attention. So we want to keep that going. We also have an opportunity to build strengthen and trust among our advocates, among elected officials, among community members who may not have necessarily had buy-in. And so we want communications that keep supporters connected to the cause. We want to ensure that they remain active. And we had Councilwoman Mejia earlier, and so I had the honor of running for office 8 years ago now. I ran for mayor in Baltimore City, and there's a slogan that you learn when you're on the campaign trail, and it is ABC, always be campaigning. Everyone that you meet is either a voter, a donor, or a volunteer. And I would make the argument that that also translates to advocacy in our advocacy work. And so we want to continue to engage the folks that we've built and met and engaged along the election cycle, because we never know who can become a potential champion of our issues. And so we want to make sure that we're doing that work to prevent supporter drop off. And we know that regular outreach after an election helps avoid the typical drop off that we see. Also keeping folks aware that like it's important once we get folks elected in office, now we need to make sure that they're going to support our issues. And so we, in order to keep those audiences engaged, we want to have regular communications with them. Oftentimes throughout an election cycle, you may have built a list of folks who are interested in prenatal to three policy. Hopefully, it could be 100 people, it could be 1,000 people, but you want to use that list to consistently engage these people, remind them that you care about these issues. We do. And we need your help and support to make sure that they're at the forefront of any particular policy change. And we're channeling that energy into future campaigns. So we may not have worked on a specific issue during the election cycle, but there's going to be issues that you're working on. And that momentum and those advocates, typically if they're passionate about creating the change, that passion isn't just about one particular issue. And so we can transfer that issue into future campaigns that we know we're going to be working on, which ultimately retains and expands our base. And so it's definitely important for us to continue this. And I'll mind you, this doesn't just apply to volunteers, but candidates as well. And I think sometimes we forget at the end of the election, someone wins and someone loses, but it takes someone who's extremely passionate about issues and about creating change in their community that's willing to step up to be a public servant. And so even if they don't win, I guarantee they're still going to be active and involved in their community in some way, and they can potentially become a champion for your issue. So engage them, utilize them. They also have networks. that can be extremely valuable to you. They also have built lists because they've been campaigning, and maybe they might be willing to share an email or share a petition or survey that you have with the folks that they've built relationships with throughout their campaign trail. You never know where that's going to go. And so don't forget about the candidates. Don't just focus on the winner, but you can also engage and send emails. You can send thank you emails to them after the election. Send it to everyone who ran, because the reality is it takes a huge sacrifice of someone's personal time. They're missing opportunities with their family, with their friends. And so send a thank you email. Say, we know you didn't win, but we appreciate you being willing to step up to the plate and serve our city, our state. That can go a long way. Next slide. Now, ways that you can engage. This is important. There's so many different methods of communication that you can use. And I think that keeping your supporters and the public up to date is important. And so maybe post-election, you can host a town hall meeting or something of the sort. It can be via Zoom, because we have this great technology to do this now. So it doesn't always have to be in person, but you can host a town hall meeting to do a recap of the election. There may have been ballot initiatives that directly relate to your advocacy issue area that were on the ballot that you can talk about. What happened? What were the votes? What are the work that's necessary to maybe get it done the next time if it didn't pass? If it did pass, what are next steps for implementation? And so use those opportunities to engage folks in large settings as critical to building your movement and continuing to push your advocacy efforts forward. Social media, of course. We know that that is a new communication technology that several million people have access to and utilize social media. And so you can do a recap of the election on social media, as well as those emails that you can send out. You can send out congratulations social media posts, or we're excited that this passed, or we're excited to work with so-and-so. Great ways to express your gratitude and acknowledge contributions of those who ran for office and can potentially become champions for your issue. Press. This is a great opportunity post-election to engage the press, where you can do things like write op-eds. You can do letters to the editor about a recap. And because the election is such a hot button topic, they're always looking for engagement around what organizational or members of the public's response are to the results of any election, right? And so figuring out the intersection of where this election is tied to your advocacy issues is important. And you can do a letter to the editor or an op-ed about what you're excited about, what challenges may come, and just push prenatal to 3 policy issues to the forefront post-election, so that you now have these folks who've been elected in office. You can grasp their attention by using the press to your advantage to talk about prenatal to 3 policy issues. And that allows you to engage in ongoing advocacy issues, ongoing campaigns. And then, of course, emails and surveys. That's a great way to engage after post-election. You may want to find out what are your supporters' thoughts on a particular ballot initiative or that passed or didn't pass, or what they're hear from them about what they're excited about for a candidate that's coming up. And this creates additional education opportunities for you to learn from, hear from them, and consistently engage. And I'll say that 8 years later, when I ran for office, I knocked on 10,000 doors personally and collected about 6,000 email contacts. And to this day, quarterly, I make sure that I send out an email, no matter what I'm working on, to that list so that I can engage them. Sometimes it's supporting another organization's efforts. Sometimes it's about a ballot initiative and my thoughts on a ballot initiative that's going to be on their ballot for the election. It can be about something in the news, and because my leadership roles have shifted, but I still care about creating a change. And many of those folks still respond. They'll email back. They'll send notifications. And so you want to continue to engage them. And some of them have even given their volunteer efforts to other organizations, right? And so if someone was willing to canvass and knock on doors and make phone calls during a campaign for me, they'd also be willing to work on an effort that they're passionate about, not a particular candidate. So it's extremely important. And so in the toolkit, it goes into greater detail about ways and strategies that you can utilize as an organization or as an individual to really maximize your communications efforts beyond just election day, because that is the beginning of our advocacy efforts. That's the beginning of us looking forward to appropriations and where money gets put, and making sure that we're building those long-term relationships. And so please do take a deep dive. I believe the link is going to be posted in the chat for our new toolkit for you to utilize it on using communications effectively beyond just election day. Hopefully I didn't go over my time, Lori. Okay.
You did great, Joshua. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. And we're going to go into Q&A now. I was reminded of one tidbit from back when I was doing some lobbying and grassroots work in Massachusetts that I meant to mention at the beginning that was super helpful. We would start out each session, we kind of got into the habit of putting together a one-pager, the organizations that were part of a coalition or whatever. I think I was working for the American Cancer Society then, and the headline was like, what the American Cancer Society can do for you and your constituents. But it could be what Excel by 8 can do for you and your constituents, or Moms Rising, or any group. And we would literally on a one pager talk about things that our organization could be doing for them and their constituents. And that was part of that intro call right after they were elected or meeting. And it was an interesting way for us to think about that. So not as targets, but as organizations that bring a lot to them and their community. And in 2024, and it will be as true in 2025 as it is today, content is king or queen. These elected officials are desperate for content that they can put out in their newsletters, in their social media, that they can, use as podium remarks, that they can have photo ops for showing up at events. And our organizations all have really great content around infants and toddlers and expectant parents and families that is so relevant, that is nonpartisan. Like, our issue is hot right now. All of the polling shows that Republicans, Democrats, and those of no label actually really care about infants and toddlers and maternal health issues. So how we package up what we can do for them and their constituents is a great way to position those early conversations. So I share that as one tidbit, and I'm going to see if folks are brave enough to come off mute. And if you'd like to chime in with any questions here or raise your hand, you are welcome to do so. I've got several that have come through in other ways to my email, but I want to give folks a chance to jump off mute and just ask a question yourself if you'd like to. I see Julia is back, which is great. Well, I'm going to ask, this is actually a very funny question, or not, maybe the answers will be funny, but the question really is around worst case scenario. Like, what is the worst thing that could happen in one of these meetings? So you walk away and your interaction with a newly elected official, what do we want to avoid? But give us if you have an example, Joshua, Dave, Julia, of something that was just like, oh, wow, that was a fail. We were really trying to build this relationship and we guessed wrong, we planned wrong. Is there anything like that that comes to mind that you could share that would be a cautionary tale for those of us building our plans for post-November elections for ourselves?
So one of the things I always do when dealing with volunteers and people that haven't been with the legislature very much is I calm fears, because I think people have this really I think one thing they think is they're going to get press on your policy. You're going to bring a volunteer in somewhere and this lawmaker is going to be like, well, what's the fiscal impact in 3 years? And they're terrified they're not going to know. So I often calm their fears about that. And then I often calm their fears that people are generally really nice. I mean, that just tends to be the case. And if they're not nice, it's typically like you're way into the campaign and something went wrong or that kind of thing, right? I'll say that I did have a meeting recently with a congressman, and I brought some people in, and it was a very non kind of what we thought would be like a really kind of a straightforward thing. And he was just like, no, I'm not doing it. And they were kind of taken aback by how gruff he was. And, and they kind of were leaning back in like, well, he's like, no, the federal government doesn't have money for this. You need to do it at the state level, and was just very frank and kind of, they even, and they kind of were taken aback, and they got in the elevator and they were all upset. And they said, like, I can't believe he was that way. And I said, no, that's great. I was like, I'd rather know where somebody stands. The worst case scenario is somebody dragging you along and telling you what you want to hear, but they don't vote for you in the end. It's like, yeah, he was a little gruff, but we know where he stands now, and we're done with him. So I think sometimes even some of those negative interactions can be positive in that regard.
Great, Dave. Thank you, Joshua.
If I could add to that, I'd say too, for me, worst case scenario, and I've seen it happen, is that you may not necessarily as an organization be watching the election cycle because you're not endorsing a candidate. You may be a C3 and not playing in it. And then someone gets elected, and then you set up a meeting with this newly elected official to sit down and discuss your issue with them. And because you weren't paying attention and you forgot to do your research on the candidate, you'd go into the meeting knowing nothing about them, their background, and you end up accidentally offending them. And so you want to make sure that you do your research before going into a meeting on what the campaign cycle is like, what comments or statements they may have made during the election cycle. You want to have a baseline understanding of who this person is so that you don't go in there and offend them, even knowing and understanding what their background is and where they've worked at before, because there may be intersections there with your advocacy issue areas. And so do your research there. Don't skip that part, even if you didn't endorse a candidate and you kind of stayed out of it. Know who you're going to meet with is critical to advancing, because as I said, ABC, always be campaigning, and anyone can become a voter, a donor, a volunteer for your advocacy effort and cause. So you don't want to accidentally offend someone unnecessarily.
To that
Absolutely.
point, I once went to go meet with a lawmaker that was well known in the community right after being elected, and I knew who he was. I went to have the meeting, and I hadn't really been following the race, and it was his son who was a junior, and I knew nothing about that person, and I was like, this was not the meeting I was prepared for. So
Counselor, let me ask you the question, and you do not need to name names because that probably would be a bad idea since you have reelection next year. But can you give us an example of when a group or an individual came in to meet with you for the first time and it was an utter fail and it has stuck with you for
So,
them?
I think that because I have a unique award-winning personality, I think, and also if I don't say it, my face does. So I think anybody who has been in my office, the first question is, I always want to know, are you lobbying me? Like, I really want to know what you want right off the bat. And I think that there have been groups that have come in under other alleged circumstances, but then they're in a roundabout way really wanted me to take a particular stance on a particular vote. And those are the times when I just feel like people are trying to undermine my intelligence, if you will. So I have said, just tell me like it is. What is it that you want? Where do you want to end up? And how can I help you get there? Because I think that sometimes we walk in not knowing how to interact with electeds, and we feel like we have to go through so many different hoops, and everyone's going to be different. Like for me, I just like it straight up. Just let me know what you need, when you need it by, and who is the problem. Because sometimes I'm not the problem. Sometimes people come in complaining about my colleagues, and I'm like, well, I'm not taking on their stuff. Like, you can go bring that over there to them. But I use those opportunities to help guide people on how to then develop a better relationship with a colleague. Because people come to me and talk, I don't know what it is, but they want to talk to me about everybody. And what I have been able to do is redirect them and say, well, here's how you get to them. I know this is being recorded. Oh my God, yeah, I'm spilling all the secrets. Every elected official, I know what makes you tick, and I share that information because everybody needs to know how to get you to a yes, and I spill the beans.
Amen. So this question is really a point in time question, and we're coming into November 2024 really quickly. And I think we all understand no matter what happens, no matter who wins in whatever race it is, there's going to have to be, or maybe there could be, some time of healing for communities and people to come together after this. I think probably all of us, at least on the screen right now, share that goal, and probably everybody else in the NCIT. We do know that the issues around maternal health and infants and toddlers and family economic security are crossing party lines, and something that we do all have in common in this country. The polling tells us that, and our own conversations tell us that. I would love to hear each of you say a little bit about how we might use that reality, that truth, to bring people together in those first conversations, even with our allies, even with people we've been working with really closely for years, to acknowledge and be representing that spirit as we enter those conversations with elected officials post-election. For me, that feels like the spirit of the NCIT, but I'd love to hear from each of you a little bit about how we can bring that into connection. And Julia, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. And I am mindful of we have 2 minutes supposedly left. We might run a minute or so over, so folks can sit tight. That would be great. But Julia, why don't you get us started on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody loves babies. Hello, right? So I think grounding in the values piece of it, of kind of like, what do we want when it comes to maternal health? What type of experiences do we want for early childhood experiences? I think grounding it in what we all can agree on, right? I think where we struggle is how we get there sometimes when it comes to policy is who has the best initiative. But I think getting people at the heart, I always say that this is not hard work, this is heart work. And I think when we are able to really get at the hearts of the folks that we're trying to engage with, it makes everything so much easier. It is that emotional appeal and connection that really brings us together despite our differences.
I love that. I don't know, Joshua and Dave, if you can beat that or you want to add to that, you are welcome to. But if not, you are also welcome to just let that be the last word on that, because I think, Julia, you summed it up so beautifully. But I'll give you a chance, Joshua or Dave, if you have anything to add there.
No, she
That's
hit
so
it
great.
right up. Yeah, it's perfect.
And on brand, Julia, with heart work. Thank you for throwing that in. That was terrific. I want to first really thank all of you for the questions that were coming in and for participating during this webinar and for having faith in what comes after November election and what our roles are on behalf of infants and toddlers and families. It's an exciting time. You will be getting a link now to the magical toolkit that we referenced at the beginning. It is quite wonderful. And just to remind you, we do want your feedback on it. So what works, what doesn't work. That is something we really hope to hear from you, because the NCID is always changing things. And before you hop off, we absolutely would be incredibly grateful if you would fill out the survey. There's going to be a pop-up on the screen. It takes no more than a minute to fill it in, but we really do take your feedback incredibly seriously. We appreciate it. I want to thank the folks at M&R Win for all of your work in putting together these incredible tools and keeping us on task, and all the work that you do on behalf of good causes throughout the country. Certainly Councilor Mejia, Joshua Harris, Dave Oberant, for sharing your time with us today. Everybody here who joined from the NCIT, we wish you all the best. May all your election dreams come true and your post-election plans be solid and give you everything you've been counting on. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.